The thing about oxalate dumping is that it can be simple for some of us. It can be complicated for others. The simplest explanation when it comes to oxalate dumping is that the kinds of symptoms that brought you to a low oxalate diet in the first place are the most likely things that are going to occur when oxalate's moving out of your system. So if you think of it really simply, the kinds of things that told you that you had oxalate as an issue in the first place are most likely going to be the kinds of things that happen when you're oxalate dumping. Okay, now let's give you a little bit more background on why we call it dumping, what's involved, just to sort of set the stage here. So oxalate dumping was a term coined by Susan Owens on the Trianglo Oxalates group. And the reason she called it dumping is that essentially you've got oxalate stored right down at the tissue level in the body. And it doesn't leave in this nice, predictable, steady stream, which would make it so much easier for all of us to deal with. No, how it leaves is in these sort of waves of oxalate, where oxalate essentially dumps into the bloodstream to be dealt with. And that oxalate is going to kind of irritate all the standard places that oxalate was irritating your body as you came into the diet. So for somebody like me, where my gut was a big issue, I always knew I was dumping if suddenly I wasn't digesting well, my gut was upset. That was a really standard kind of symptom for me. I also, before I got on the diet, was having some problems with my thyroid. So I would suddenly feel cold, or I would have waves of cold over the course of the day. There can be some really predictable things like that. My brain fog would get worse. My insomnia would start up again. So there's these predictable kinds of systems that would be affected, if you will. So typically, some of the main systems to be impacted by oxalate would be the gut, because that's ground zero. Everything from the mouth all the way through, this is where your body first encounters oxalate. So those systems are going to be particularly affected in many cases. But we also can have oxalate being moved into the tissues by certain cell transporters, which are designed to be able to move oxalate. So these cell transporters would be ideally moving oxalate out of tissues after oxalate has been potentially made by the body as a metabolic end product. So there's another little piece of the puzzle. All of us produce some oxalate, and that's called endogenous oxalate production. We all do some of that. It's not actually something to be afraid of right out of the gate. However, some of us produce more oxalate than others. And that can be an issue in terms of whether or not you even experience dumping for some people, because your body's actually producing more than normal amounts of oxalate as part of our metabolism. The good news for us is that unlike other kinds of toxins or poisons that our body has no idea what to do with and has a hard time getting rid of, because our body actually produces a certain amount of oxalate out of the metabolism, we actually know how to get rid of oxalate. The challenge is when we overwhelm our system with a lot of oxalate, and then there's a lot of work for the body to do. So back to oxalate dumping. Oxalate dumping is when your tissues, in a order and priority, which is kind of decided by your body, move oxalate out where it's been stranded. And so that stored oxalate is secreted out of the cells. It actually takes the cells some energy and some work to get rid of it. I think that's part of the reason why it doesn't happen in bigger amounts more constantly, because the tissues have to be ready to move it. But it also explains some of the symptoms that we can get. So oxalate moving by secretion means that you can have oxalate actually leaving through the skin. So you may have heard things either on the Trianglo Oxalates group or other places where they talk about oxalate, that some people get it moving out through the skin. That's because it's moving out through secretion. And any of the ways that we can secrete to get rid of things out of our body is one of the potential places where we could actually be dealing with oxalate dumping. And interestingly enough, secretion is going to be happening to get rid of oxalate in the kidneys, because the kidneys are going to take in the blood from the bloodstream, they're going to filter it, and then the toxins are secreted into the urine. So kidneys are one of the ways we get rid of oxalate. We can also be getting rid of oxalate through the gut. So this is not well understood, but we secrete things back into the gut for the gut to get rid of them. So we can actually be secreting oxalate into the small intestine so that it can move through the intestines and leave via the stool. So that's another way that we can get rid of oxalate. We can be moving oxalate out of the respiratory system. So some people will be, as you may have read on some of the groups, lung dumpers. It means that they're actually moving a fair bit of oxalate out through the lungs. Those people could have symptoms like asthma, getting worse when they're oxalate dumping. They could have more phlegm. So you do actually have this process by which the lungs can be getting rid of some oxalate. And interestingly enough, there's a connection to cystic fibrosis. So part of the issue with cystic fibrosis is cell transporters where they're involved in the movement of oxalate. Anyway, and one of the additional ways we can be getting rid of oxalate is via mucous membranes. You have mucous membranes in the sinuses, again, so people will talk about having a lot of pain in their sinuses when they're dumping. And we have mucous membranes inside the gut. So that's something to keep in mind. We have mucous membranes, a lining, if you will, inside the bladder because of the kidneys releasing oxalate, though that lining may be inflamed by it. So wherever we have mucous membranes, endothelial, which is a fancy word for skin, and we've got that internally and externally. So there's more than one place where we can be moving oxalate there, and kidneys and digestive tract are going to be especially, I would say, impacted. Although there's other things about dumping which can be very interesting.